You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
You're listening to The Spirit Dimension with your host, Kerry Greenaway, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening and welcome to The Spirit Dimension. My name is Kerry Greenaway. It's Sunday evening and I like to bring you something a little different on a Sunday evening. Now, I've got a couple of lovely gentlemen in the studio with me. Now, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I had the lovely Graham Smith on talking about the work he's been doing in regards to new technology he's developing, which runs alongside a theory that's out there. Now, Graham, bless him, did his best to try and explain the theory and then said, get the guy who wrote the book on. So I was like, okay, I will do. Now, Graham, welcome to the show. You're co-hosting with me tonight.
I am. Thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to the interview today.
Yeah, same here. So when you try to work and explain that theory to me, it's quite an involved theory, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is very, very, very detailed, or can be very detailed. And I know that it can be explained in far more simpler terms, but I think from my perspective, because I'm not exactly completely 100% fully of understanding the full depths of the theory, it's quite hard for me to kind of interpret how, exactly how it works, etc. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I understand personally, but trying to kind of get that over in regards to my experiment was quite difficult. So I thought, well, what better way to let the listeners know exactly how the theory works, etc., is by getting the actual person who did the research and wrote the book on it.
I totally agree. Well, we have managed to do that. We have got Mr. Thomas Fusco in the studio to try and break it down so we get to understand the theory a little more. Good evening, Thomas. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. I'm here, baby.
Now, can you give us a little of your background before we get into your theory? Can you give us a little insight into your background, please?
Well, and I've talked about this a lot. Back in my late teens, early 20s, I had several profound, what people would normally call psychic experiences. I prefer to call it parapsychological. That caused me to question the model of reality that was taught to me at university. And so consequently, for me, rather than going into an experiential type avenue with it, for me, it brought to me fundamental questions as to how the universe is put together. What kind of universe can allow these types of events to occur? How is it put together where these things can happen and be observed? And so seeing that the current model of reality, which we can kind of look at as all that there is when we talk about reality, seeing that the current models didn't really adequately address these types of things, had to come to an understanding that something is either incomplete or incorrect with the current models of what physics thinks of as reality. And that's what started me on to that journey of exploration and research. And finally, after nearly 3 decades of working on it, I finally felt that in 2011 I was ready to publish. And that was Behind a Cosmic Veil. And this theory is called supergeometry, supergeometric theory. And this is where we're at. And ultimately what it does is draws a new vision of reality that not only incorporates the findings of science, but also incorporates what we would call the paranormal and supernatural and even traditional religious views. And what separates this from all that has come before it is not only does it marry nicely and is very friendly with science, but it also makes predictions that are experimentally testable, which is the fundamentals of scientific theory, and is something that nothing else in the paranormal field up until this era has ever been brought forth. So that's kind of where the background is.
Okay. Where do we start with this? Okay, so what's the current understanding at this moment of the cosmological setup, as it were? I'm going to dumb it down for me, you understand? Use simple words.
Oh, I like dumbing down. Trust
yeah, dumb it down
I've
for
spent
simple
a lot
words.
of time to try to get it as simple as possible. Because that's the way I like it too. Albert Einstein felt the same way. He said, if you can't explain what your theoretical work is, the ideas behind it, in simple ways, then you really don't understand your own theory. So Einstein was very much in favor of reducing things to very simple elements. I would say the fundamental characteristic of current scientific thought, the current state of cosmological theory, is that reality is physical. And that what is physical is reality. And that's it. There is nothing that lies outside the physical. Everything that comprises reality is physical. Anything outside of the physical is not considered reality.
So basically, if you can see it, test it, prove it, then that makes it the physical, right?
Pretty much, yes. Yes.
But like you say, that leaves out huge gaps in understanding other concepts.
Yes, because
like even emotion.
Even in physics, we've come into an age, really over the last couple decades, where we have literally run out of physical content, which is how Einstein put it, physical content, to explain all our observations. Every type of an observation or a phenomenon that we can observe, there's a handful of them for which there is no physical content that can act as the cause for the effect that we see. One of the biggest ones is when they talk about dark matter and dark energy. And scientists often in the public sector, in the public podium, so to speak, tend to talk about these elements as if they're a foregone conclusion. The reality is that we have absolutely no evidence that dark matter or dark energy exists. We don't even have much of a way of testing it. All we know is that according to what we understand in cosmology, close to 90% of all the physical content in the universe is missing. And that's because we would need that much more content to explain all the phenomena that we observe in the universe. So since we see all this phenomena, all these effects, and we don't have a physical cause to account for it, then we have to make it up. We have to just conjure imaginary physical substances to explain it. Ergo, we have this dark matter and this dark energy. What scientific or what supergeometric theory attempts to do is to, within a scientifically meaningful framework, draw a model of reality where the physical is only part of reality. There's another part of reality that is superphysical, above the physical, or what I call supergeometric. And we can get an idea of the nature of that superphysical aspect of reality by observing the effects that the mechanisms or the mechanics in that part of reality is leaving on the physical face of reality. And so with that, we come up with a number of new concepts that not only provide us with a lot of answers for paranormal and supernatural phenomena, but also explains some fundamental mysteries that physics is still wrestling with.
Thomas, could you just explain exactly how you drew your conclusion on on the model that you've put together? What sort of research did you come across that kind of built the bigger picture, and what was the kind of breakthrough moment for you during that time? Obviously, we're talking about 30 years worth of research here, so can you kind of explain a little bit more about how you came to this conclusion?
Well, I think the first element of it, Graham, is the accepting the idea that all of reality is not physical. There's something more to it than just what is confined to the physical. That's one thing. The next step was to accumulate evidence, anomalous observations. And by anomalies, we talk about observations that don't fit into the current existing picture. And collecting those observations and that body of evidence, that body of data, one of the steps was to accept paranormal and supernatural phenomena as real events. Yeah. That these things actually do occur in the universe. They have been observed and measured. And so consequently, if we don't have anything physical that can account for them, we have to look for something outside the physical. But the way in which these events occur, how they take place, how they unfold, tells us something very specific about the mechanisms at work that cause these events to occur. In other words, there's only so many options in the deck for picking out whatever cards are going to put together a hand that makes sense. And so this is where that process came about. As you know, Graham, it's multifaceted. I can't pick out any single element and say this is the key, other than the fact of looking at all this evidence and working on various solutions and ultimately coming upon a model that actually works.
Okay. So, we've gone... it's an incredible theory that you've come out with that does transcend a lot of the normal, everyday perspectives that are bandied about out there. And it does, like you say, incorporate lots of questions and areas that don't normally get pulled together. Like if you can explain one area, but under one theory, but that doesn't explain that under another theory. But under your theory, it does seem to pull it all together, doesn't it? With this super geometry.
Yes. For example, very common paranormal research, where you have a number of people have come up with some very intricate and eloquent explanations for, let's say, EVP, electronic voice phenomena. But when you take that same model and try to apply it to cold spots or apparitions, suddenly the model breaks down. It doesn't have any explanation for those other events. And we know with paranormal phenomena, particularly in paranormally active sites, that we have a collection, a whole catalog of various types of events that are observed in these active sites. It very rarely is just a single paranormal type of event. There's groups of things going on together. So this is a strong indication that they're all the result of the same single set of what I call paranormal mechanics or principles that are bringing these things about. Mm-hmm. I might mention, Kerry, that one of the things that we have to look at is to try to understand things more scientifically in the paranormal field. This has always been a big challenge because, as we were talking about a little earlier, the paranormal investigators are primarily focused on experience.
Yeah.
They're looking to experience something.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are thrill seekers. Some of them are trophy hunters. You know, that this group collected this many EVPs. Well, we got these many EVPs. Listen to mine. They're better than yours. And in this, they think they're making progress when all they're doing is just repeating the same thing that's been done over and over and over again.
Yeah, there's no explanation as to why they're being able to capture these anomalies.
Yes. And as long as they experience what they're seeking, that's all that matters. Mm-hmm. That's the end for them. They really don't care why it's happening. They only care about participating in the happening.
Yeah.
In some way. And, you know, these are things that are not talked about much in this field because it's kind of it's an uncomfortable subject. It's not a convenient subject because it calls into question, why are you even involved with this? Why are you doing this? And what is the ultimate goal?
Yeah,
some people, yeah.
Yeah, you have to think of the why, don't you? You know, that's what always drew me on it in the field was it's not, I've had that experience, but why did I have that experience? What are the mechanics behind that made me have that experience? Was it a psychological? Was it a logical explanation from the physical? You know what I mean? It's that why that draws you on, whereas, you know, a majority of people don't seem to want to know the why. They just like you said, the experience itself.
Yeah, Kerry, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, if you're going to an amusement park, maybe out of 5,000 people that are going on the roller coaster, there might be one that says, you know what, I wonder how this thing works. Mm. They don't care how it works. They only want to experience it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for them, that's enough. They don't need to know how it works to buy the ticket and get on the ride.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I know some people don't like that when they hear that, but because it strikes home, it's real, it's the truth.
Mm-hmm. It's true. So, right, let's have a look. Let's actually look at, as much as we can, because it is incredibly involved, your theory, okay? Why then, and this is a question that is far too simplified for your theory, but why do we have these experiences then under your model?
Well, we have, when we say why, there's two aspects to that, Kerry. And this is also something that is very important in critical thinking to distinguish the two. And in the paranormal field, we don't normally do it. The best way that I distinguish them is looking at a law enforcement agency that has various departments Now, one department is criminology. They want to know why the criminal did this, why he or she showed up at a certain place, did that particular crime, did it in a particular way, what was their intent, motive, so on and so forth. Now, that's a part of the why. But the other part of it has to do with the forensics. And this is something that has been grossly ignored in the paranormal field. In other words, in the crime, for example, if somebody used a gun, the forensics wants to know how the gun works. They want to know how it could actually kill somebody. They want to know what velocity and distance it could travel, what damage it does, how it causes the results that we're observing. And so your why question is twofold. I've stayed away from the criminology. There's enough criminologists out there. I don't want to know why dead Aunt Mary wants to talk to you. I want to know how in the hell she can talk to you. You know, or if it is dead Aunt Mary, which is where that criminology end of it gets very ambiguous, where the forensics is very scientific. For example, let's talk about a fundamental way of looking at things here in the paranormal field that will help out. And that is, what type of phenomena are we looking at in terms of a scientific description? And that involves cause and effect. So, for example, let's say we are photographing or we're filming a site at night. We have a camera set up. Let's say it's just designed to take in normal light. Let's not talk about the infrared and all those wavelengths. Just normal visible light. And it's very dim, and we see a shadow of a figure walk through the view. We've recorded it. Now, if one of the investigators are walking through that room, that's normal, because we're seeing a figure where light is either being reflected or emitted off of a physical object. There is a local physical connection between the cause of the person walking through and the effect of the light, of how the presence of that figure is affecting the ambient light that the camera is receiving. That's normal. This is what we normally experience. Everything is connected, local cause and effect. Even with what we're doing right now on the radio or over the internet, even though you can't see the signals that are carrying this information, there is a physical connection. Even if it's an electromagnetic compression wave conveying those signals of information through the air from a transmitter to a receiver, there's a physical connection between those 2 points. From the source to the destination, there's a continuous connection of physical causes and effects. In paranormal phenomena, here's where the problem is. If what you captured on film was paranormal, means there's nobody walking through the room. There's no body there. And yet we're seeing the same physical effects, but there's no local physical cause. So this allowed me, and this was something, Kerry, that I had to do early on, was to come up with a scientific definition, a scientifically relevant and meaningful definition for what paranormal phenomena really is. What does it mean? And what I came up with, the only conclusion I could come up with, is what's called in physics non-locality. Or to say it in a long way, non-local causality. We have a local effect that's normal. We can pick it up in a camera. We can see it with our eyes. If it's a disembodied voice, we hear it with our ears, just like a normal audio or visual effect. The effects are absolutely normal. What makes it paranormal is there's no local physical cause connected to the effect. For example, a disembodied voice is going to sound the same as a normal voice. The effect is the same. The difference is in a normal voice, there's a set of vocal cords physically connected to the electromagnetic or to the acoustic compression wave that hits our ears. There's a set of vocal cords connected to it. In paranormal, there are no vocal cords. We have the effect with no physical cause. So ultimately, a scientific definition for paranormal phenomena are effects that are observed that have no local physical cause connected to them. Now, this opens up two things. First of all, it opens up our thinking. We're no longer thinking of the disembodied voice as the paranormal thing. We're looking for the source of that, the cause of it, as what is paranormal. The voice that you hear isn't paranormal, that's normal. So that's one thing it does. The other thing it does, Kerry, is it bridges us. It bridges the gap between paranormal and established physics, because we are now playing on their home turf. We're using their rules and their terminology to bring this together. So now if you go to a physicist and start talking about non-locality on a macro or relativistic scale, as a paranormal event would be, suddenly the doors open. And the two of you can sit down and have a logical and meaningful conversation just with that one concept. So this is very vital, and we need to focus on that. Now, there is another aspect, Kerry, of paranormal phenomena that is in common with normal phenomena, but paranormalists never think of it. In fact, it's a shame that most scientists never stop and think about it either. It's the concept of information. This is so vitally important to realize what this is. Everybody remembers back in school the being taught matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And I do it in a sing-songy way because the teachers that were teaching to you don't understand what that means. They're just regurgitating what was taught to them. And we can go into that if we have time. The point is that over the last several decades, we've come to understand that that's not sufficient. That we have added an aspect to those mass energy conservation laws that were derived from Einstein's relativistic theories. E equals mc squared is where mass energy equivalency and conservation comes from. We've come to understand that the information from which mass and energy is assembled, the blueprint, the diagram, the raw data around which these things are assembled, itself can neither be created nor destroyed. And it's called quantum unitarity. One of the problems with our models of black holes is that information goes in, but it doesn't come out. And that violates quantum unitarity. It violates the conservation laws. So, when we have in an audible effect, which is an which is an acoustic compression wave, or let's say an electronic event, EVP, or even visually, where we're talking about electromagnetism, light being a bandwidth, a frequency of electromagnetism. We are observing both electromagnetic compression waves and acoustic waves that are carriers of information. In other words, if somebody sees an apparition, what shapes that apparition into a recognizable human form is information.
Yeah.
That information is being carried to our eyes by an electromagnetic compression wave. A radio signal is an electromagnetic compression wave carrying modulations that represent the information on that wave, so that when it reaches our radio antenna, we have a device that can translate that into a meaningful sound. It's all information. So we have to figure out where the information is coming from. If somebody sees an apparition of dead Aunt Mary that died in the house 100 years ago, the physical source of that information is gone. Dead Aunt Mary's body is all rotten. It's all decomposed. And yet, the information that was contained in that physical body is still being transmitted somehow to our local space. We're observing an image of dead Aunt Mary. Kerry, this is one of the ways that I came to the understanding that we are dealing with something that is not physical, because there's no physical source left for dead Aunt Mary's image to be manifested in a way that we can actually observe it and recognize it, let's say by comparing it to a 100-year-old photograph, where the information recorded on the photograph did come from the original woman's physical body. That's gone. And yet we're still receiving that information. It can't be stored physically. The idea that this stuff is, when people say that, oh, you know, help me, guys, what's it called when something like it's a movie that keeps playing over and over again?
You mean like the stone tape?
The stone tape, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like a stored memory within the locality.
Yeah, and they say somehow that's recorded on the background, which is another way of saying I have no flipping idea what I'm talking about. Because there's nothing in the background that could store that energy. It would first have to be able to record it in sufficient fidelity and in sufficient volume to actually recreate a recognizable image. That's one thing. The second thing is that, well, first it would have to record it. It would have the ability to record it. Mm. Secondly, it would have to have the energy to retain that information. Moreover, it would have the ability to store that information in an accurate form. Mm-hmm. Next, it would have to have the ability to play it back. Mm-hmm. And it would also, in an apparition, it would have the ability to project it in the proper location. And if the apparition walks down a hall, it would have to have the ability to pan its projector. Like a projector would have to pan to move an object down the hall. So whatever is quote unquote stored on the background, that background, whatever it was, would have to have the physical ability to do all those things.
Yeah.
I have yet to find any paranormalist to name me any substance in the physical local area. I don't care if it's a sump pump, if it's limestone under the house, the floorboards, the space-time, the drywall on the walls, nothing. None of that has the capabilities of doing all those things. And see what we're doing here, Kerry, we're critically thinking. We're looking into something fearlessly, with courage, and saying, let us work on the premise that we accept this paranormal phenomena as being real. As Einstein told us to do. He said anytime you're testing a theory, you must start with the premise that you accept all the elements of the theory as true. Then you go about disproving it. It's not the other way around. So if we accept paranormal phenomena as true, And we get into these, we take the evidence, the observation of a residual haunt, so to speak, and look at it fearlessly and courageously, without the fear of threatening one's own personal beliefs. We find that there's no physical substance in the local area where that event is occurring that could perform all the actions that that substance would have to perform in order to create that residual active haunt. The information then must not be coming from local space-time. It's the only answer.
Okay.
See, and this is what makes it complex, guys. I just, say something else real quick. It's not so much the idea. Once you arrive at the idea, it's like, oh, that makes sense. That part is not complex. What's complex is arriving at that conclusion.
So, Thomas, can you just kind of explain exactly where this information comes from then? Because I know we've touched on that, obviously we've identified that it's not locally within our kind of universe, our physical universe. So where does this information exist? And how does it come forth from wherever it exists into our four-dimensional reality?
Well, here's the big enchilada, and this is something that where information leads us to a very startling conclusion. And again, it's a little bit complex, but I'll walk through it as best I can. In physics, we do have a phenomenon called photon teleport. It's not the actual teleporting of a photon from one location to the other. It's the spontaneous transference of the information concerning the state of one photon to another remote photon instantaneously without any time or space being taken up in the transference. We take we take a set of entangled photons. They're correlated so that they act as a pair. One has an upspin, one has a downspin. And
so we're talking quantum entanglement, yeah.
Yes, that's the balance of the pair. Now we split them up. We're able to do this and send them traveling in opposite directions at the speed of light. Now we know that the speed of light, so far we still know the speed of light is the uppermost velocity possible in physical reality. So if these two items are traveling in the opposite direction of the speed of light transmission from one would never reach the other. Because one's traveling away from the other at the speed of light. You'd have to be going double the speed of light in order for information from one to reach the information of the other. Yet under these circumstances, we pass particle A through a magnetic filter that reverses its spin. And particle B will instantaneously reverse its spin to maintain the balance in the original correlated pair, even if those photons are separated by light years. Physics does not have any explanation for it. They just accept it as this is the way reality is put together. You'd be surprised when you get into the upper levels of theoretical physics how many things are just accepted as is without the compulsion to explain why it's that way. They just accept it.
Right, so they came up, sorry, to clarify this for myself really on this one, because I got a bit lost there. Photons act in a specific way that you've just outlined, but they can't explain why they act that way.
Correct.
But they do,
because it violates. Yes,
but it's a visually, if that's the right terminology. They can see it. It's recordable.
Yes,
but they can't explain why they act in that way.
Correct. All they know that it does. That there is some connection still between the two particles, but it is not possible, according to our understanding of physical reality, for that information to be immediately transferred from one locale in space-time to a remote locale in space-time, bypassing both space and time. Because traveling through space would involve time. Traveling through time would involve space. They're all tied together. And the instantaneousness, instantaneity, whatever the word is for it, of the simultaneous events precludes that anything physical is involved. So we know that information can be transmitted outside of what is physical. And we know the integrity of that information can be maintained. If we take the phenomenon of remote viewing, we have the same kind of thing going on. Somebody's out in the East Coast and they remote view a 1957 red Chevrolet accurately at a certain location out on the West Coast. Or you folks that are in the UK, you could pick any two locations that you'd like. In the US, those are a big enough distance that we all get that. All right, the remote viewer sees a 57 Chevy. What body of information is being conveyed? Just the geometry of that automobile is huge, a huge database of information, let alone its red color that has to do with spectral analysis of what light waves are bouncing off and what light waves are being absorbed. That's being immediately and instantly conveyed over a great distance with no physical connection between the receiver and the transmitter. The information must be coming from a non-local source. Now, this takes us to the next step. The 57 Chevy is not a transmitter. So how in the world is the information being conveyed to the remote viewer on the opposite coast? There's only one logical explanation. That both the image in the viewer's mind that has now been converted into electrochemical signals, which is why the image can be stored in that human brain, and the information of the car on the opposite coast are all coming from the same source. That the information that creates and holds the car in its shape is the same information that's creating the image in the viewer's mind. Wow. Now we're starting to get into actually how the universe is put together. In the beginning, we had a big bang. And here's where it really has tied everything together. Because I said, well, what evidence do we have for this? We do have evidence for it. And that is in the theory of the Big Bang. Which the more evidence that we acquire in physics, the more observations and measurements that we observe, the more it seems to confirm this idea that the universe began as a quantum singularity. That it was not physical, because a singularity only has a single coordinate. Everything in space-time is defined by 4 coordinates, 3 spatial, 1 temporal, that are actually fundamental elements of space-time. And everything gets embedded into it. You have height, width, depth, and time. Einstein proved this to us. In a quantum singularity, you only have 1 coordinate. Everything is compressed into a single coordinate. It cannot be physical because there are not 2 coordinates to measure a difference between the 2. Without differences, you can't have dimensions. Now, let me interrupt in saying, folks, I know that this sounds complicated at first because I'm throwing a bunch of stuff at you. But every single thing that I'm talking about, every single idea that I'm stringing together in itself is simple. It's just that I'm stringing them together so rapidly it makes your head spin.
Yeah. I'm not going to deny it.
Yes.
I'm following it. I am following you, though. I am seeing where you're coming together with it. So that's good. That's a good thing.
Okay, now, the quantum singularity somehow explodes, figuratively speaking, and we have the Big Bang, and the universe is created. The first thing that emerges is a bubble, an expanding bubble of space-time, which existed 400,000 years before the first mass, to the best that we can figure. Now, suddenly, in this expanding bubble of space-time, primordial particles begin to form, like leptons and neutrons. They are assembled according to a set of information. There was no daddy and mommy particle that these things were given birth by. Everywhere in that bubble at the same time, neutrons began to assemble themselves according to the exact same blueprint. Everywhere in the universe simultaneously, which means the information must have been stored in the singularity. Now we're talking about God. Now we're talking about what the Christians speak of when they speak about the mystical aspects of Christ, and they say all things were made through him. And in him all things hold together. It's the exact same principle. God spoke information. He spoke the word light, and it assembled in the physical realm. But let me get back to what I was talking about, because of all the philosophical or religious concepts, none parallel this model more than the Judeo-Christian Bible when it talks about the nature of Christ. What my theory says, or what standard physics says, is that the quantum singularity converted itself into the universe. What supergeometric theory says is that the quantum singularity is still active. The universe is still emerging from it. And therefore, information that's stored there is still emerging from it too. This is why the universe is expanding. According to supergeometric theory, it's not dark energy that's expanding the universe. The universe is just continuing to be generated. Now,
with these neutrons that are being attracted to each other, and is that what you're meaning there? Because I know the universe is still expanding. Sorry.
Yeah, the neutrons are part of what was created.
Right.
Yeah, and they have certain behavior that indicates to us that they are still tied together. These particles are linked together by a source of information that still exists outside of physical reality. Now, if we take this idea and bring it into the realm of paranormal phenomena, what supergeometric theory says is that the manifestation of a paranormal event or effect is the exact same mechanism that's at work that brought the universe into being. Wow. That's what really cracks the code behind all this. So what this does is it tells us that Edgar Cayce, when he talked about the Akasha, was correct. There is an interactive storehouse of information that exists outside the physical. David Bohm called it implicate order. Plato called it forms. The idea goes back a long, long time. So what Graham has been working on, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if a bubble of expanding space-time opens up in a local room, like where a paranormal event is occurring, and information comes down from the supergeometric, from the superphysical, into that bubble and begins to manifest, it begins to materialize because it's become subluminous. It's dropped down below the speed of light. We should be able, the predictions is that we should be able to observe and measure every effect that would be predicted by that kind of phenomenon, by that kind of event. We would see the emergence of an electromagnetic field out of thin air. Consequently, the activity within the physical element of the pressed air, of the stressed air molecules around this expanding bubble would not only generate an electromagnetic field, it would also generate a heat signature out of nowhere. The other thing it would do in an expanding space-time bubble, in the presence of physical content like the air, we know the thermal energy is held by the air, by the molecules that are in the atmosphere itself. The less molecules there are, the less thermal energy that volume of air can hold. So in an expanding bubble, in the presence of physical content like the air, there would be a lower density of molecules inside the bubble as there would be outside, which would mean it would result in a cold spot. It would generate its own gravitational field because it's bending space. It's warping both space and time. It will not only generate a dilation of time, but it will also generate a gravitational field, according to Einstein's model, which could very easily explain why people get a feeling of heaviness at the onset of a paranormal event. And on and on and on. You asked earlier about a Reader's Digest version of this. That's kind of where we're at with it.
Oh, my word. And this brings you two together, really, doesn't it? Because, Graham, you're trying to develop the technology to measure this effect.
Yes, that's correct.
The effect which would ultimately back up the cause.
Yeah, I mean, the experiment I've developed is to detect the emerging bubble of space-time. So to detect the change of gravitational force. So when this bubble emerges, I should be able to, with the experiment that I developed, to detect these anomalies within our local environment. So what I would want to correlate with that, as well as detecting or gathering the data around that, is actually to capture the effect of the final effect that we would classify as our paranormal phenomena. So, for example, should it be a light anomaly, etc., I would want to be able to detect that visually on camera to correlate with the data that it catches, because obviously this bubble of space-time will emerge to allow that information to present in our local environment or in our four-dimensional reality. So obviously Thomas is kind of give us a really good kind of detailed kind of description of how this all comes together in order to where it comes to where my experiment lies currently at this moment in time. I mean, like I've heard Thomas on the radio plenty of times on YouTube, and read his book and so forth. And I mean, Thomas, you were saying that earlier as well. If you spoke to a physicist who specializes in relativity, if you kind of hypothetically said, what sort of effects would we experience should there be a bending of space or a warping of space-time with our local environment, then all the different effects that we kind of look for when we are at a paranormal site, are all the things that will emerge from this bending of space-time. The things like electromagnetic fields, cold spots, heat signatures, light anomalies. All of these things come from that effect on our local environment. That's why when, for example, when Thomas is talking about, that there are lots of different theories out there that explain lots of little elements, this model, it fits every type of phenomena into it. Even so, for example, when we're talking about remote viewing, obviously in Thomas's book, Behind the Cosmic Veil, he categorizes paranormal phenomena into different categories. So that would come under a category called transmentation. It's all kind of mental related. So, for example, this information comes from, this other dimension outside of space-time. So that's how it bypasses the kind of space-time kind of conventional laws of, nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So it bypasses that in order to, for example, so the information of that car or whatever it is Thomas was referring to, it comes from this fifth dimension, bypasses the kind of the laws that we have with regard to govern us with the speed of light and the information that travel that distance into that person's into their mind in order to them kind of capture that image of it. That's my explanation. Thomas can probably explain it better, but that's along the lines. Yeah.
You're right on it, man.
Yeah.
Get more specifically, and people can research this, but the idea of a wormhole, the technical name for it is an Einstein-Rosen bridge. Einstein and Rosen were trying to solve certain problems with a unified field theory, and they came up with this structure that was possible in space-time that would allow us to have gravity, listen to this, gravity with no local physical source. Einstein needed that in order to help build his unified field theory, which tells you that our normal idea of gravity is wrong. The idea that I'm trying to say, though, is that if you found such a physicist versed in relativity and asked them, what would you get? What would be the effects that we would see if you saw a miniature opening, a mouth of an Einstein-Rosen bridge opening up in a room in a house? And you would have to hold yourself back from laughing as this physicist would describe to you many of the effects that occur in a haunted site without even knowing he's describing a haunted house to you.
Yep.
That's big.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I have a question. Might be a little bit of a thick question here, right? If these little openings of space and time bubbles are occurring, right, bear with me. They're going to be. They could be opening anywhere, at any time, at any place, anywhere.
Based on the processes that are occurring in the superphysical and the supergeometric, yes.
Right. So surely something that's not a small thing that's happening. That's quite a big natural occurrence going on in our environment.
Yes.
But the effects we're seeing aren't that big, and they're not affecting people. So you can't, if you stepped through one of these bubbles, you wouldn't actually have a physical effect on yourself, would you? You might pick up the information like a medium would or something like that, but physically you wouldn't necessarily register any differences. You're not going to like step through this bubble and then appear somewhere else, are you? It's not like a portal.
Well, yeah, you're talking about something going both ways. Let's talk about that for just a second. I argue that people are influenced by these expanding bubbles at paranormal sites. When they talk about feelings of heaviness and they talk about feelings of nausea. That their bodies are being to some extent, the whole area is being twisted by these bends on some level.
So do these bubbles then just like pop out? Well, they're sort of just like a little, like you would actually see like a little soap bubble, for example. They sort of appear and then they just disappear. Is that where we're going with this thought, or are they? I'm trying to just understand this more for my understanding of it, really.
Yes.
Because it's quite a big concept. I'm trying to really... I have to twist things a little bit sometimes in my mind, as Ashley is well aware, to get it really...
No, that's okay.
It's hard to get your head round. It's really thought-provoking.
It's counterintuitive, too, because it works in contradiction to what not only our senses tell us, but what physics has taught us. It actually works in opposite in some ways. And I'll try to explain what I mean. We understand, we were taught, based on Einstein's theories, that every piece of physical content in the universe is enveloped in its own pocket of space-time. In other words, you may have heard that if you take your hand and slap it against a tabletop, the atoms and the molecules in your hand are not physically contacting the atoms and molecules in the tabletop. It is the space-time surrounding them which is making collision with one another. If the molecules themselves came in contact with each other, you would have quite more of a reaction than just simply hearing a slapping sound on a tabletop. What my theory says, is that these pockets of space-time are not being formed by the material content inside of them. This is the standard model, that you have an object like the sun or a planet. Sometimes talking about big things makes it easier. That bends the space around it, forming a gravitational field and a bubble around the object. What supergeometric theory says is that the bubble comes first. Then the information comes down from the supergeometric into that bubble and materializes into the object. Supergeometry gives us the opposite model of reality. It tells us that everything is being created and maintained and sustained from a realm outside of the physical. And what we're seeing are the results of it. This is why supergeometric theory says there's no such thing as dark matter. Mm-hmm. It says that the extra gravitational effect that we're observing in the universe, above and beyond the physical content, is actually being generated from the superphysical. And that's why we have these huge gravitational effects where there is no matter, where we have these areas of what they call gravitational lensing in the emptiness of deep space, where there's no mass to bend it. The mass is being formed inside the bends, which is what happens according to my theory. Let's say when someone sees an apparition, That apparition is a materialization of non-local information within an expanding pocket of space-time. The exact same thing that happened when the universe was created. So all of these effects, all this mechanism of information coming through into the physical, the stream of which creates a bubble of space-time, and the information materializes in that bubble of space-time once it reaches the speed of light and below.
Okay.
That exists with everything in the universe, all physical content in the universe. It's happening with a human body, with our bodies. Now, when we die and our bodies are dissolved, that bubble breaks down into little tiny bubbles with all the particles of decay. But the circuit is broken, so to speak. The connection is broken. That large bubble that enveloped our body kind of sucks back up. Yeah.
So
it kind of sucks back.
Sorry, carry on. Yeah, so when you have like something physical, like your body, you die, that connection gets broken because you're physical, but the energy doesn't go, it transforms and goes back into the
the energy stays in the physical. It's what shaped it that recedes.
Okay.
In my book, I have a diagram. I talk about picturing a model that Einstein used,
right?
With a rubber membrane, and on the one side is the super geometric, on the other side is the physical geometric. And you take a quarter, and you press it from the super geometric side, and the membrane is so thin that you can see every single detail of that quarter. And this is a process that stays in place. It's like almost a pressure that continues to push that information into the physical realm where it materializes. Now, if that quarter dissolved, like a human body rotting or something, the large bubble would simply just suck itself back into the flat fabric of space-time. And the equilibrium would be maintained.
Right.
Until those little particles assembled themselves into a big enough bubble, bigger and bigger, as more and more of that kind of information can come through. And then it starts all over again. I know it's kind of deep because it's a little different.
It's very deep.
From a paranormal phenomena point of view, let's take an idea that I have. And this is a speculation. This is not part of the theory. This is a speculation based on the theory. We typically find paranormal activity very commonly associated with past human trauma.
Mm-hmm.
We also suspect and have some evidence for that human beings can directly affect the environment around them.
Mm-hmm.
Without actually having to touch something.
Mm-hmm.
Telekinesis is one of these kinds of ideas, mind over matter. What if, and we have to add another element, human beings have the capability of creating. We can take forms of energy or forms of information and convert them or transform them into physical equivalents in the real physical world. We can imagine a coffee cup and shape it. We can imagine a 747 jet and build one. We can imagine a computer and build it. Our brains have the ability to transmute information directly into its physical equivalent in the physical world. So there's much evidence that would point to the fact that we can affect the nature of physical reality around us. What I say is in cases of extreme trauma, in some way, it damages the fabric of space-time. It fatigues it, like a piece of metal being bent back and forth. It weakens it. And so it allows these bubbles to form very freely, because the fabric of space-time has lost its integrity. It's like a weak spot in an old inner tube in a tire. If you blew up the inner tube and had a weak spot, it'd come out like a bubble. And that's what's happening in a haunted house. That's why some sites are haunted. And where the bubbles are, the information is looking to continue to complete the circuit that it once had. It continues to want to complete the flow, that it had a connection between the superphysical into the physical with the person that died 100 years ago. So the fabric of space-time is damaged. The information comes in that's connected to the greater body of information in the house, pushes through that weak spot, and materializes an image of the woman who died 100 years ago.
Mm. Wow.
It does. It creates many battles in your mind thinking about it.
It does. I mean, as we've gone through, I was thinking, I got this, yep, got that concept, yep, got that. And then as we're getting like to this point now, it's like, you're right, it is so thought-provoking, and so I've got, like you say, battle. I can't formulate what those battles are. I would need to think about that. Do you know what I mean? Because that's where I'm at with this at this moment in time. I feel like my brain is so many concepts. You go, yeah, well, that makes sense, and that makes sense, and that makes sense, and that makes sense. And then we take, actually, yeah, I get that. And it's incredibly fascinating. It's so, okay. It is absolutely incredible how you've come up with this out of everything that you've researched. I know it's 30 years of research, and this is the point you're at, isn't it?
Yes, and it answers so many questions that it's frightening. And I'm talking about answering questions about cosmological mysteries in science.
It's covering lots of different areas, isn't it? It's answering questions from lots of different areas, from things that are happening in space to something quite simple like a paranormal experience.
Let's face it, again, in my opinion, based on the sound scientific principle of the study of systems and subsystems, you define and describe a system. And then subsystems can emerge from the processes of that system. But the subsystem will never transcend or contradict the laws and principles governing the system that the subsystem grew up in, that the system gave rise to. It can't contradict or operate outside of the system that gave birth to that subsystem. That being said, if paranormal phenomena occurs inside the universe has to be put together in a way that allows that to occur. The laws and principles governing it has to be built into the laws and principles that govern the entire universe.
Exactly. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in it. I mean, first of all, before I became aware of supergeometry, in my head, obviously I was always kind of having these like battles with thinking, well, how does this work? How does this connect to one another? And I was automatically coming with this kind of conclusion that actually, there must be multiple phenomena of different, with different explanations for it. Then I came across this theory. I heard at one of your interviews on YouTube, and I think for me personally, it probably saved me many years worth of going down the wrong route, if I'm perfectly honest. And when everything was unified under that one simple kind of mechanism, I decided that this is something I need to focus my attention on and see where it goes with. Hence why now I'm at that point where I've developed this experiment to test. Well, currently the one that I've got to test one element of, one of the physical effects that, or, that would occur on, within our four-dimensional reality. And obviously looking to build another one that will test another element of that on top. So this is what I think, is such a unique theory that I've not come across it in any other shape or form, that I feel deserves the respect in order, at least for people to go out there and test to see, whether or not, there's verifiable evidence to support, the kind of theoretical predictions that are made by yourself there, Thomas. So for me, it's been the biggest eye opener I've ever I could ever dream of.
And where else are we going to find in the universe a phenomena or a class of phenomena that is regular enough that we can kind of predict an area where it would manifest, like sunspots? We can't predict the occurrence of sunspots, but we know if we set our sensors pointed at that solar disk constantly, we're going to see a sunspot at some point, just like in a paranormally active site. But it's on a human scale. It's not just relatively predictable and dependable, but it's on a human scale that we can actually set up human scale instruments and equipment to measure it. We don't have any other kind of phenomena that we know of that we can do that with. So the paranormal is the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe.
Oh, it literally has flipped it all right up on its head, hasn't it?
Yeah, here, let's
me.
look at it another way. If I can mention this, where people can relate with it normally or more personally. Thought, ideas are manifested in the physical brain as electrochemical patterns. That's how they're manifested physically in the brain. We know this. That's a fact. That's an established fact. And the information, the type of information will affect the pattern of that electrochemical storage device. Patterns will be different based on the information. Just like my voice sounds different than your voice, it sounds different than another person's voice, or a clarinet sounds different than a trumpet. The collection of information is slightly different. Now let's take something of telepathy, where you have, or the remote viewing. The information comes into the brain and materializes as an electrochemical pattern that can be measured and observed as normal physical reality. What I say, this helped to connect the strings here, I say that materialization of information, of non-physical information, into a physical pattern in the brain is the exact same process that materializes an apparition out of thin air.
Yeah.
Right, we are running over. So, and it is a huge concept, and we could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours, I'm sure. I suggest that if you want to get your head around this, you go away, you buy the book, which is Behind the Cosmic Veil. I've shared the link into the chat room, and I've also shared the link to the website, Thomas's website, into the chat room too, so you can read some more information, some blogs, and find out more about the book and the theory behind it. It's very, very involved. But sorry, Graham, carry on.
No, I was just going on to Thomas's website. It's quite an interesting one. I believe you've got a sample chapter on your website, and also there's kind of little snippets of bits of information around the theory as well. Before just to kind of give you a kind of taster before you purchase a book, to kind of give you an idea of the type of things that you're going to find when reading through it.
Oh, totally. I mean, I've been looking through that today, and it is absolutely fascinating. And it gives you that brain space to be able to absorb more of what we've been talking about tonight. So some concepts have gone a bit too quick for me, and others I've got as we've gone on. But it's definitely something I'd like to explore more and read on more. It's not something I'm going to leave behind on this one, because it is fascinating, completely fascinating. And the more you hear, and the more I've spoken to Graham, and the more I spoke to Ashley, and who've read the book and spoken to Thomas a lot more in depth than we've done tonight, it makes sense. It's starting to make sense to me. But seriously, reach out, because this one is fascinating. Thank you so much, guys. This is absolutely amazing. I think the work you've done is absolutely amazing.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me on.
Oh no, you're very, very welcome, and thank you for coming on. And Graham, thank you for coming on
No,
and helping me out with this one.
That's all right. I think you had it in hand, Kerry, so well done.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. On that note, everybody, I would just like to reiterate, if you go over to the Parasearch Radio group page, we have a competition going on that is going to get drawn tomorrow when I go live for this week's show roundup. Don't forget, if you miss any of our shows, pop over to our YouTube channel, click like, share and subscribe. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you once again, Thomas, for coming on, and Graham for helping me co-host.
Okay, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
And I will see you next week. Take care. Good night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.